A Sweden Quran-burning stunt sparks outrage. The United Nations will now meet to discuss acts of religious hatred. It comes after a man burnt the holy book outside Stockholm's main mosque. But will there be consequences for the country who allowed the protest? I'm Melinda Nusafora, and this is The Newsmakers. The United Nations Human Rights Council will hold a debate on religious hatred at the request of Pakistan. It will likely convene later this week. Last Wednesday, during the Muslim holiday of Eid al-Adha, a man of Iraqi origin burned a copy of the Quran in front of a mosque in Stockholm. It sparked widespread condemnation from multiple countries, including Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia and Morocco. Swedish police granted Salwan Momika a protest permit, but later authorities launched a hate speech investigation into the incident. Let's take a look.
Burning, kicking and stomping on the Quran, desecrating Islam's holy book under the guise of protest, and all with the express permission of the Swedish police. These acts by Iraqi-born Salwan Momika have prompted outrage from the Muslim world.
This attack, which ignores the feeling of 2 billion Muslims around the world, cannot comply with basic human rights, let alone the freedom of thought. It is a hate crime that feeds on Islamophobia.
In a civilized world like in the European community and Western world, a person to come up and provoke 2 billion Muslims who confess Islam, it's really uncalled for. It's a provocation.
Iran's foreign ministry has summoned Sweden's diplomatic representative. And in Pakistan, protesters have expressed their outrage in the streets. They're urging their government to cease diplomatic relations with Sweden until the matter is addressed.
I believe the government of Sweden, by supporting such an event, has hurt the religious sentiments of Muslims around the world. I demand the government of Pakistan to cease diplomatic relations with Sweden.
We would boycott all Swedish products for an indefinite period. We won't stay silent against this crime. We won't sit idle until this issue is resolved once and for all.
It's not the first time Sweden's been in the spotlight on this issue. In January, Danish-Swedish right-wing leader and anti-Islam activist Rasmus Paludan staged a protest outside the Turkish embassy in Copenhagen, again burning a copy of the Quran. Swedish police opened an investigation into Paludan. He was arrested in absentia on suspicion of incitement, insult and gross assault against an official. Such demonstrations have widened the rift between Sweden and Turkey and could have serious consequences for Stockholm, which needs Turkey's backing to gain entry into Nato. Sweden's foreign ministry says the burning of the Quran or any other holy text is an offensive act. It says such acts are disrespectful and clear acts of provocation. It says it's strongly against expressions of racism and xenophobia-related acts. But the foreign ministry also says the Swedish people have a constitutionally protected right to freedom of assembly, expression and demonstration.
But when does freedom of speech cross over into hate speech? For analysis, we're joined by Ahammed Hussain from London. He's the spokesperson for the UK's Muslim Public Affairs Committee. Omar Makram is in Stockholm. He's a podcaster and a public speaker. And from Williamstown in the US is Farid Hafez. He's a visiting professor of international studies at Williams College and a non-resident senior researcher at Georgetown University's The Bridge Initiative. Gentlemen, thank you all so much for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Omar, seeing as you're in Stockholm, let's begin with you. Where is the line between freedom of expression and religious hate crimes?
I think the line should be drawn when we're talking about a hate crime. It should be drawn rather at violence, because speech in itself that is not a direct incitement to violence is not a crime.
Ahmed, what do you think about that? It is not violence to a person, but would you consider violence to a holy book to cross the line between free speech and a hate crime?
Does violence exist in a vacuum? Does it come out of nowhere? You know, although a physical act of violence is undeniably a crime, the incitement, the normalization, the dehumanization of a target community or an individual, that is clearly where the track towards violence begins. In terms of, sorry, could you repeat the question?
Whether there is a line between the freedom of speech and a hate crime. Can the two things coexist?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk in the abstract, or we could take it to the concrete level. In terms of in Sweden right now, there are definitely certain things, and I can say for a fact in the UK, there are certain things that cannot be said. For example, if someone criticized Sweden's desire to join NATO, that is something that would be vociferously disagreed with in public discourse in Sweden and in the UK as well. So we can't just pretend on an abstract level that hate crime, that freedom of expression has no consequence, and every single point of discourse has a green light to happen. We in the Muslim community in the UK, for example, if a student goes into school and talks about what's happening in Palestine right now today, for example, they would be reported under counter-extremism laws for being too divergent from UK foreign policy. And so on. So to act like there isn't already red lines in society, in public discourse, is laughable.
Farid, let me bring you in here. It's difficult to compare apples with apples here when you're talking about a country like Sweden that has such broad freedom of speech rules. This is not the first time we've seen acts in Sweden that have been interpreted as Islamophobic. Do you think that these two principles can exist? Freedom of speech and not committing hate crimes?
Well, I think there is a thin line, and maybe I'm more on the side of those who are supporting freedom of speech. In terms of, you can basically say everything you want, but as was already said before, there is always a limit, right? And these limits are usually coined by the specific histories of countries and the way they give space or not to religious expressions, etc. I think what is really interesting, if we discuss here the Swedish case in specific, is, because there is a lot of outrage now because of the symbolic Quran burning. And I understand that. I understand that people's feelings are hurt. But at the very same time, I have to say, if you look into the history of Sweden in recent times, they have been super Islamophobic in terms of their legislation. I mean, they have cracked down on Muslim civil society organizations, defunding them, closing schools, and Muslim organizations have a hard life there. And a lot of that regulations and the crackdown is, again, justified by very transgressive anti-terrorism legislation. So what is attacked there is actually the opinions of people, right? So people, Muslim folks who just want to do their schools, they want to do their educational institutions, they are being attacked, and their freedom to organize themselves is questioned because there is the argument that they are extremists. Right, so you have that kind of institutionalized Islamophobia on the one hand, and then you have the freedom of expression on the other hand in terms of the Quran burning, and you can clearly see some hypocrisy here as it is playing out in the way that Muslim life is treated in Sweden today.
Omar, I can see you gesturing there, wanting to respond. What's your reaction to what Farid has been saying?
It's absolutely not true that there is a discrimination that is targeted at the Muslim community here in Sweden. And it's not true that there is this kind of like institutional crackdown on Muslim organizations.
But there are institutions that are closed, sorry.
The schools,
yeah,
I mean, Omar, we've discussed with you before, schools that have closed that are all Islamic schools.
Yes, it is. But that does not mean that it's discrimination. There is there are rules that are applicable to everybody. So, for example, if you invite people who are spreading homophobia or who are spreading sexual discrimination and so on, of course, you will not be able to get government funding. These are just the rules, and for everybody. It's not like the rules are different for Christian organizations. They are the same for Christian, Muslim, and so on. So this is the opposite
on the
of
paper, yes.
Omar, let me ask you this then. Have you seen other holy books attacked in a similar way in Sweden? There's been multiple burnings of the Quran, but have you seen the same happen to a Bible or a Torah?
Not that I know of, but at the same time, there have been, for example, art exhibitions about with the on Jesus, for example, and that was totally allowed. I find a hard time to see that it would cause an uproar if something equivalent would happen, for example, about Muhammad or Muhammad cartoons here in Sweden. And it has happened, for example, with the Lost Peaks. So there is double standards to even how, if we are talking about equal treatment, then Muslims in the West and Muslims in Sweden have to accept the same treatment as Christians, for example, accept. We have freedom of speech here. That is for everybody.
Let me put that to Ahmed then. How do you accept that? Is there a problem of integration into this very multicultural and freedom of expressive society in Sweden? Are the communities becoming more segregated and closed off from each other?
I mean, I would basically agree with the point that your question is raising, and the way the political landscape is shaping and reshaping kind of reinforces that. You know, last year, late in the autumn, we had another round of elections in Sweden, and the Sweden Democrats came in on a coalition. The moderates and others coalition members broke the cordon sanitaire around Sweden Democrats, and what happened was that the Sweden Democrats were allowed to have an influential direction in the Tito agreement, where the coalition members basically laid down how would they work with each other, what were their policy agreements, and so on. And so what we saw happen with the Quran burning last week, I would argue that it was a direct impact of some of those policy decisions that the Sweden Democrats have had an influence in, particularly in the cut of the cut in welfare protections for non-citizens or migratory citizens who are in Sweden. I believe that the individual who burnt the Quran last week was of Iraqi descent or an Iraqi migrant. And what we will see as more and more influenced by Sweden Democrats on the coalition policies, we will see, unfortunately, more and more of these things happening as care and provision for migratory citizens is stripped. And why is it stripped? It's to fulfill an ideological, to feed an ideological bonfire. And so long as that ideological bonfire, which includes Islamophobia, xenophobia, fear-mongering of migrants and so on, so long as that bonfire carries on being fed, then it's going to carry on burning brightly and catching the voter base's attention, which is exactly what a new, just into the mainstream party like the Sweden Democrats wants. So it is really, really important to realize that nothing happens in a vacuum. If Islamophobia already exists, then is it being pushed institutionally? If it's being pushed institutionally, who are those, in terms of political moves and shakers, who are those who are benefiting from it? And that means that the electorate has a opportunity and has a real duty to protect the minority away from the tyranny of the majority and safeguard its needs and rights.
Farid, let me ask you then, if we're talking about governments and institutions, do you think that the Swedish government has a bit of an identity crisis here? On one hand, they're upholding some of Europe's broadest freedoms of expression. On the other hand, the government came out and said they acknowledged that this was an offensive act. Can they have it both ways?
Well, I mean, there is separation of powers. So if the police authorities decide to do one thing, and the government, obviously, because it wants to become a part of NATO, has a different perspective. So let it be. So I don't see the contradiction here. What really I have to say at this point is, even before the far right came to power, like even during the days when the Social Democrats were in power, we had a lot of, again, and I fully stand for this, there is a crackdown on the Muslim organizations. Yes, maybe there is equality on the paper, but there is something else that is going on, which is that there is lobbies who are pushing for the exclusion of Muslim civil society organizations in the political landscape. And this is happening in Sweden. There are security institutions, intelligence services who are pushing this agenda. Back in 2016, there was a recommendation of the security service recommending the closing of Muslim schools. And yes, obviously, I mean, once these authorities put those policies in place, they try to appear as if it would be non-discriminatory. But as we can see, it is discriminatory. If you defund Muslim associations, youth associations, because they are allegedly Islamist, then yeah, this is a trick that goes along the book and along the lines of many of the playbooks that we have seen across Europe, right? So obviously the appearance is we are for equality, but in fact the practice is not. And what we always have to understand is, what is the racial structure of a lot of European societies? Muslims are not equals in terms of being fully accepted in socio-economic terms on the same level as any other organization. If we speak about Protestants or Catholics, these are the dominant churches that have power, that have influence, that are landowners, that are important institutions, that have their media corporations, etc. Muslims are the working poor. They are mostly representing the working poor. They are not on the same level. So if you speak about the law in theory, that's one thing, but the practice is another thing.
I'm going to come back to a broader Western sense of whether Islamophobia is getting worse. But before we get to that point that you've made, I want to bring Omar in, seeing as you are in Sweden, with this same question. Do you think that the Swedish government is trying to play both sides, upholding the freedom of expression, but also trying to quell this Muslim anger?
It could perhaps be interpreted as that, but at the same time, freedom of expression is very strong here in Sweden, and this is why they have to be very careful about criticizing it. Even the criticism that the foreign ministry has issued when it comes to the Quran burning has been widely criticized here in Sweden because it has been perceived as basically a criticism of freedom of speech, which is something unsuitable for the government to do. Again, I must state that this is baseless speculation, that there is directed discrimination at the Muslim community and Muslim organizations here in Sweden. Again, if everything that has happened was connected to specific acts, there have been schools who have been run by Islamic extremists, even people linked to terrorism. There has been incidents of gender segregation in schools, which is against the rules here in Sweden, against the law. There have been, like I said, speakers who are promoting homophobia, who have been invited by these organizations. And that would not have been accepted from any Christian organization, any church, and so on. So this is the opposite of discrimination. This is equal treatment, which is supposed to be.
Ahmed, what do you think with regards to the Swedish government's response here? Do you think they're trying to toe a more diplomatic line purely because they know that these acts are going to have ramifications with regards to their membership to NATO?
What we're seeing here is their primary concern being their voter base. The largest coalition member is the Sweden Democrats. They cannot be seen to be kowtowing or pandering to exclusively Muslim concerns. So, although the bigger picture is NATO membership, the bigger picture is the very concept of freedom of expression. If we look at the nuts and bolts, if we look at the basic instinct of any politician is what is this going to do to our votes at the next election? So they are now in a corner, as any fringe party that comes into the mainstream, where they have to, the Sweden Democrats, they have to keep everything in check, everything in balance. Foreign policy decisions like joining NATO, and constitutional rights like freedom of expression, but also pandering to the voters who brought them in the first place, and remaining true to their ideology that had been very populist for multiple decades.
Right.
But
Farid, if I could ask you with regards to NATO, do you think that this is going to have, these sorts of acts in Sweden are going to have broader implications because of their NATO membership? Do you think that is at the forefront of their minds when they are denouncing these sorts of acts?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they have foreign policy interest, and this is what is basically informing their stance. And I mean, again, you know, it's interesting because on the one hand, freedom of speech is freedom of speech, and you know, this whole idea of the symbolic burning of the Quran is something that we had in history. We had in European history. There is a long history in terms of burning the Quran specifically, but burning books in general, right? So if you can't burn people, you burn their symbols, and the Quran is here the symbol of the people that belong to the Muslim religion. Right. So obviously, the Swedish government has to take a stance here because this is not seen as the most civilized way of protesting against the religion of Islam. I mean, there is a lot of Islamophobia anyways in European societies. So there are also other ways how you could express your disdain from the religion of Islam. But really what here is at stake is the foreign policy interest, what drives the Swedish government. And what I really would urge Muslim countries to do is not to only criticize countries, governments, when things like that happen, because this has been an individual at the end of the day. It was not the Swedish government that was doing that. They are not responsible for that. They should criticize when Muslim communities are harmed institutionally. And this is happening. And what exactly I am drawing from here is the European Islamophobia report, the Swedish report, which was written by Anna Ardin and other people who are on the ground in Sweden reporting on what is going on in Sweden.
Omar, we've only got about 1 minute left, so let me just ask you, do you think there will be any additional softening of Sweden's push towards or to uphold its freedom of speech in order to ensure its accession to NATO?
That's I find difficulty to see that this could happen, even if some people here in Sweden are pushing for that. There is, like I said, freedom of speech and freedom of expression are very, very strong here in Sweden, and I find it difficult to see that the public opinion would swing that far, that such acts as Quran burning would be banned.
It will be interesting to monitor, of course, as the NATO summit in Vilnius approaches in earnest next week. We'll have to wait and see what is discussed there. Obviously, Turkey still has very serious concerns about its accession. Gentlemen, thank you very much for all your opinions and analysis here on The Newsmakers. And thank you to you, our audience, for watching. You can, of course, follow us on Twitter and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Melinda Nusafora. Thanks for your company, and we'll see you next time.